ready for takeoff.
Hello, and thank you for coming to my talk. Did anyone fly in from the Houston Hobby Airport? A few of you? Okay, I did too, Monday late evening, and I came out of the gate, I was looking for the exit, walked past a bookstore, and I saw this book. I was like, yeah, but how did you know? That is exactly what I'm here for, and I'm freaking out because it's going to be my first time ever speaking at a conference to a live audience, and the book was just there with its calming presence, not judging, and we had a moment there, and I went ahead and gave it a 5-star rating on Goodreads for good karma. Anyway, hi, my name is Sijia, and I'm currently working as a software developer at PayPal/Braintree. That's what I look like on a good hair day. I'm on a Ruby team. We write Ruby on a daily basis. I've actually only exclusively worked with Ruby throughout my entire dev career, which is pretty rare, or so I've been told. So this is like the one conference I could go to and somewhat successfully pretend to know what I'm talking about. But in addition to writing Ruby for work, I do and have done a few other things. I'm also an academic translator, a snowboard instructor, and sometimes a bartender at events and fundraisers. I also play the drums in a rock band and very occasionally get on vocals. And I've previously worked as a layout editor, I've worked in customer service, and I've taught languages online, a bunch of different things. And that was a non-exhaustive list. And a lot of these things might not seem to have anything to do with software development at first glance. And I have a confession to make. I don't write code outside of work. And for the longest time, I've felt ashamed to admit this. It's been one of my biggest sources of my insecurities and self-doubts, and I've wondered if that simply makes me less good of a developer. Because if you work in tech as a dev, this is what you feel like you should be doing. You feel like you should be constantly honing your skills, keeping them sharp and up to date to stay competitive. I look around and I see people building very impressive personal sites and apps and making contributions to open source projects in their spare time. A lot of you here are probably doing that. And I see these people who are just living and breathing and bleeding code. And a lot of times I can't help but compare myself to them and feel inadequate. And apparently I'm not the only person that feels this way. This person wants to know if it's bad if they don't code outside of work. And this person doesn't program in their spare time and wonders if that makes them a bad programmer. And really, I'm not alone. And it's not just about not coding outside of work. I feel like when it comes to the absolute amount of time I've spent so far strictly writing code, I've simply spent less time doing that in general compared to a lot of other developers that I know or work with. I haven't always been in software. I went to school for electrical engineering, which is arguably very much a technical discipline, but our curriculum was mostly signals and circuits and not exactly programming heavy. And after I switched to software, I've taken some breaks in between and worked a wide range of not-so-technical jobs. I still do some of them today on a freelance or contract basis. And perhaps some of you have gone a similar path or recently switched to a career in software development from different roles or industries, and you might have some of those non-technical experiences that just look somewhat irrelevant on your resume. But are those experiences really as irrelevant as they might seem? Honestly, as someone who does a bunch of different things, I've constantly been amazed and inspired by the similarities and connections I've noticed between what I do day to day as a software developer and my seemingly irrelevant non-technical experiences. And there are skills that are absolutely 100% transferable, there are concepts and patterns that are similar, and I'd like to share some of what I noticed with you in this talk today. So I've been working as a freelance translator since 2015, and I work primarily with the Chinese-English language pair. I translate scientific reports and research articles to English so my clients can submit them to international journals and potentially, hopefully, get them published. And the common perception is that the skills required in translation are mostly linguistics related. Like you need to be fluent in 2 or more languages, human languages, to be able to translate. And while that is true and very much necessary, there are a lot of other skills that go into doing the job. And for a while, I've noticed that translating somehow feels similar to coding, but I couldn't really pinpoint in what ways exactly until I had the idea for this talk, and I started to really examine the relationships, similarities, and connections between coding and the other things I do, and I realized that translating and coding actually do require a lot of skills in common. Both activities require you to be able to become an expert of a certain topic or concept in a short amount of time. In a tech role, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this, you might very often start working on a project with very little knowledge of the project per se in the very beginning. And this is even more so the case for an ad hoc task thrown at you or an incident that you get pulled into when you're on call. You're not expected to know everything about what you'll be working on before you start. You are expected, however, to quickly familiarize yourself with the project or the topic, to understand the context, and to catch yourself up to speed using all the resources you have access to. And you do that by systematically gathering, digesting, and evaluating information. And we're really talking an abundance of information. This could be the code base, commit history, logs within the system or on some external monitoring platform, or you could find yourself reading through descriptions or comments in Jira tickets, Slack threads, email threads sometimes. You might have to look things up in your internal documentation, or you simply have to Google or talk to people and ask a lot of questions, but to really actively acquire all the information you need, and also process that information and make informed decisions based on that information and implement those decisions. And this entire process of approaching and solving problems is extremely similar in translation, where you're not expected to already know everything before you start translating an article. Especially if you're working with journal submissions, you're not even supposed to already know, because those could be never before published findings at the frontier of their respective fields and disciplines. And that's a realization that helped me sort of shift my perspective, because I would beat myself up sometimes thinking, I should probably know this already, or why don't I know this already? And a lot of times you're not expected to already know everything going into a new task, but you are expected to learn and to pick things up as you work through problems. When you're translating, you are expected to look up and verify the terminologies and make sure you're using the most appropriate ones, which would be similar to deciding the most appropriate data structure or method to use when you're coding. And when you're collaborating with other people on a translation task, you want to keep the style consistent, and when it comes to writing code, that style consistency is important as well across the code base. And when you're translating, you are expected to understand the logical relationship between one piece of information and another to be able to work out a way to organize and present the information in a manner that makes sense in the target language. So you see that the process and the skills involved are very similar in both activities, which really explains why I almost feel like I'm exercising the same set of cognitive muscles when I'm working on a translation project versus a programming task. Another thing I do is I teach snowboarding. I am a freshly certified level 1 snowboard instructor, and I work with beginners. I guide them through the entire beginner to lower intermediate progression from their first day on snow, or sometimes first time seeing snow, to making baby turns, to eventually a point where they can safely and comfortably go down a blue run on their own, which for those who don't ski or snowboard is a slope typically angled between 14 and 22 degrees. I had to look that up, and ideal for those who are just starting. And I've been really surprised by how much crossover there is between teaching snowboarding and coding, specifically pair programming. Teaching snowboarding, or formal instruction of any kind really, and pair programming both involve this process of communicating very technical concepts to people in a way that they can understand. And you might have to break down the information in digestible chunks and demonstrate with examples. In both activities, you are providing and/or receiving immediate feedback. The feedback could be informative, in which case you simply point out what you're seeing. In snowboarding, the rider can't see themselves ride, so this can be very useful. It could sound like you were leaning back when the board was pointing downhill. In software, we can always see the code we've written, but sometimes we lose sight of the bigger picture, so it can be helpful to receive some purely informative feedback, like this method is 30 lines long and has 6 levels of nesting. Or, hey, we're checking the same condition in a few places. The feedback could be evaluative, which is when we judge something against some criteria, like established coding standards or best practices, but without suggesting how to proceed. In snowboarding, you might hear, your range of motion was not enough to build up the energy you need for your ollies. And some software examples could be, I can't tell what that variable is getting assigned to because that part is unclear. And then there's corrective feedback, which is when we point out what's counterproductive and suggest ways to improve. And when I teach snowboarding, it's really not about me telling my student what they should do. It's more of me showing or suggesting the things they could try, because there might be a more efficient way of doing things. But you're not forced in any way to accept that immediately into your way of doing things. I might suggest that you try playing with the placement of your weight over the board and feel the change in control and use that to your advantage when you're side-slipping on an edge, for example, versus trying to gain control by tensing up all your leg muscles, which can tire you out really quickly and just might not be as efficient. This is important in software development as well, because you might say things to your pairing buddy like, we've repeated this chunk a bunch of times. We could maybe refactor and try it up. Or if we move this calculation outside the loop, it'll improve the performance of the method. And last, but definitely not least, empathy. Everybody talks about empathy, but still it can never be stressed enough because people forget sometimes what it's like to be a beginner. It can be extremely overwhelming. Deep diving into the code base for the first time can be really overwhelming. It could be like, what am I looking at? And same as snowboarding. It can be really overwhelming in the beginning because it's cognitively challenging. You're constantly checking, are my knees bent? Is my back straight? Is my waist centered? Am I looking in the right direction? Are my hips aligned parallel to the board? All of that while you are going. It can be a lot until it becomes second nature. And things can be really intimidating as well when you're just starting out. This could be what a bunny slope looks like to a beginner on their first day. And I'm just going to let you look at that for a second because it's super impressive. It's a little choppy on here, but still. So the first time you point your board downhill, when you make your first turns and you start to pick up speed so fast, that can be really scary. And when you teach, you have to be aware of these fears, which apparently our dog friend there has none. But you have to be aware of these fears and worries the other person might be dealing with and acknowledge them, address them, and understand that the other person's perceptions and thoughts can be wildly different from yours. And you want to work through the challenges together with the other person. And this collaboration with empathy is so important and essential to facilitating a smooth and pleasant learning experience, both on the slopes and at the workplace when we're pairing. I've also noticed some similarities between playing the drums at band rehearsals and this particular software development methodology that we all know and love. Pictured here is the band I'm in. We are the way back. You can see me there all the way in the back. That has nothing to do with our name, but we play covers of classic rock from the 60s through early 2000. We meet every week to work through our set list. And there's this pattern every time. So my role as a drummer in a band is to keep time and provide this consistent and steady rhythmic support. But unless you are a lawful neutral drummer who learns all the songs and memorizes entire music sheets before going into rehearsal, which I'm most definitely not, the first couple of runs through a new song or a new section of a song are almost guaranteed to be bumpy. Your beats might sound hesitant, you might miss some of them and forget to cue transitions, and that's normal. Your bandmates might not actually say that to you, but you know that's what they're thinking. So you practice your drum part until you get it sounding pretty bad, but that's okay, because the point is, all you're trying to do here in this phase should be to get to the next phase, where your beats become nice and steady and you're familiarized with the music. You might need to count the bars to time your entry and know where your fills should come in, to cue the transitions from one section to the next in some way. It doesn't have to sound exactly like the original recording, because nobody sounds exactly like the original recording when they're playing live. And once you have that down, you can start fine-tuning those details, dynamics, etc., and to really work on those complicated fills. Add a little flair here and there, and you repeat this cycle when you move on to another section of the song or the next piece of music. And the repetition of this cycle at band rehearsals feels extremely similar to this other cyclic process, which is, you might have guessed, test-driven development, TDD. So we start by writing a test and define the feature, or what we want the class to do. In this case, we want the drummer to play a steady boots and cats and boots and cats during the bridge or guitar solo of Reptilia. And we want to make sure the test fails. I mean, it's pretty hard to mess that up, but our drummer here probably dropped a stick. And this would be the red phase. And then you write just enough code, the bare minimum of code to implement the feature to make the test pass. And you see the blissful dot. That's when you know that you are in the green phase. And after you get all your tests to pass, that's when you start to restructure your code. You make it simpler and more readable, you optimize the performance, and that's the refactor phase. And you repeat this cycle when you move on to the next feature. You go back to red, write a new test, and watch it fail. And once you get used to this sort of cycle or pattern, you understand exactly what to do at each step, and you can follow it easily. A lot of times you might be very tempted to refactor or tempted to check what RubyConf is whining about while you're still trying to get the test to pass. And when I'm on drums, I can be tempted to do a fancy fill when we're still learning the song, which might throw everyone off. But by strictly following this red-green refactor cycle, which is a proven methodology, it might just make your life easier. And you're reinforcing this pattern every time you repeat it, which helps you work through problems more efficiently, whether it's in a rehearsal studio or when you're writing code. So there are so many connections between the tech world and non-tech activities if you start looking for them. That was just from my own experience, and I got really curious and can't stop wondering if other people who have a lot of non-technical or non-engineering experience have also noticed connections and similarities between software development and other disciplines and fields of work, like I did. And I realized that I have easy access to a developer community that is vibrant and friendly and slightly more obliged to respond to my questions in comparison with internet strangers. I went to my company Slack. But just out of curiosity, I want to take a poll here too. How many of you have had significant experience working in non-technical or non-engineering roles? Can I get a raise of hands? That's like all of us, almost. We're properly uniting the eclectics in this space. So I did a poll in our Braintree Slack workspace asking the same questions, and the response was super interesting. So 44 people responded in total. 25 of them, or 56.8%, which is more than half, have had significant experience working in non-technical or non-engineering roles. And of these 25 people, 17 of them did not study CS or STEM in college, which is more than 1/3 of the total response, which is fascinating. And again, thanks to this occasion, I had a great excuse to reach out to these wonderful coworkers of mine that I never had a chance to talk to before, asking to hear more about their experience. And they come from so many different backgrounds. Before they started writing code, they were doing graphic design, they were selling comic books, they were studying linguistics, and they were compiling financial records. And somehow we've all found our way to the same field. And I'm so happy that I got to talk to them and hear their stories and pick their brains and learn about the connections they found between software development and a variety of different fields. I learned about, for example, how writing grants in a nonprofit was a lot like designing an architecture for a new feature when you figure out how to put things, existing parts together and work with the existing infrastructure. I learned about how in organic farming, diagnosing why a particular crop isn't doing well is similar to triaging an issue in the tech stack. And one of my coworkers worked in retail in a camera shop, and they told me about how being able to digest product information like lenses and flashes and camera bodies and how they interoperate and communicate that to customers in a way that they could understand, how that skill helped them in their current role as a tech lead. And another person talked about how the communication practices they learned from their experience working in customer service helped them deal with conflicts more gracefully in their current role as an engineering manager. And something that came up a lot when I was talking to my coworkers from non-traditional backgrounds was insecurities that were generally centered around not having spent enough time writing code, either because they don't have a computer science degree or because they've spent a lot of time, a lot of years doing other things. One of them was getting interviewed for a staff engineer position and still got questioned about not having a computer science degree. And a lot of them found themselves constantly having to explain or justify their non-technical backgrounds or experiences when they don't have a straightforward trajectory, which is something that I could relate to a lot. And one thing that we've all been doing consciously or subconsciously is that, and that is super important, especially when you have a lot of non-technical experiences while working in or transitioning into a dev role, is that you want to craft your own narrative. So instead of mechanically listing all those experiences and past titles, you want to be able to tell a compelling story. You want to help other people understand how your non-technical experiences can help you succeed in your role as a developer and beyond. Well, you have to understand it first, and you have to first identify the connections between your non-technical experiences and your tech role and lessons you've learned along the way, which is a really interesting and rewarding exercise in and of itself. And then you'll be able to connect the dots for other people. Show them the connections, because a lot of times they're not immediately obvious. And when the connections aren't immediately obvious, we tend to very quickly deem the skills and experiences as simply irrelevant. But it's your job to craft your narrative that makes sense to people, that connects the dots, and focuses on the unique value you can bring. And when we're talking about our non-technical experiences, because we might still feel insecure about them, about doing and having done those things instead of coding, it's easy to stammer, to sound uncertain, and even apologetic, like, yeah, I'm a developer now, or I'm transitioning into software development, but I also do this other thing, and also that, and yeah, I did this other thing for a few years. But if you talk about yourself in a way that conveys confidence, people will be less likely to judge or question you, not that they should in the first place. But if you share the fascinating connections you've found between your non-technical experience and your tech role, they'll pick up on your enthusiasm, and they might even mirror it back to you and ask you to tell them more about those connections. So if we go back to the question at the beginning, am I less good of a developer if I've spent less time writing code? And you catch yourself asking questions like, how will I ever measure up to those people that started coding in 2nd grade? Ask yourself these questions instead. Can you deliver? Are you effective? Are you meeting expectations? If you work with clients, are your clients happy with your service? If you work on a team, do your coworkers enjoy collaborating with you? And if your answers to these questions are yes, you are competent in your role, and you shouldn't let anyone else make you feel otherwise. So I've talked a bit about combating insecurities, but it's not like I've won the battle. I'm still constantly, actively fighting it. It's an ongoing fight, but I want to remind myself and you all that we should try to not discredit our non-technical experience too quickly, but rather focus on the connections and the unique advantages you've gained from those experiences, and have a holistic view of things. And you can be a good, well-rounded developer, not in spite of, but because of your non-technical experience. And if you happen to be in a position where you are evaluating candidates, and if you have a candidate with a lot of non-technical experience, it could be a 2nd career developer or a 3rd, 4th, 5th career developer, you can help by inviting them to tell their story and giving them a chance to prove themselves as a competent developer that they might very well deserve. And at the end, I would like to invite you all to share your experiences, technical or non-technical, and the connections you may have found. There might be a Slack thread going in conference Slack, so we could share our experiences and get some inspirations from each other and connect and support each other as we do great things. That's all I have. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming here today. If you have any questions or anything, if you have anything you want to share, or if you just want to talk, please feel free to come to me after this talk, or catch me in between talks, or reach out to me through LinkedIn or email or conference Slack. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. I shall see you around. Thank you.